Imagine a cold sip of cola on a hot day. That specific moment. The crack of the can, the hiss of cold air escaping. The first sip. Ice cold, sharp, sweet. The bubbles hitting the back of your throat. For 1 second, the heat doesn't exist anymore. You know exactly what I'm talking about, because almost every person alive knows that feeling. In over 200 countries, in 100 different languages, on every continent on Earth. One drink, one feeling, recognized everywhere. But here is what almost nobody knows. That drink began not as a refreshment, not as a pleasure, not as the most successful product in the history of commerce. It began as medicine, brewed in a brass kettle, in the backyard of a pharmacy, by a man who was addicted to morphine and desperate to find a cure. This is the real story of Coca-Cola. You are with me on Custom Stories in English. Find something cold to drink. Let's begin. Atlanta, Georgia, 1886. The American Civil War had ended 20 years earlier, but for a lot of men who had fought in it, the war had never really ended, not inside them. John Pemberton was one of those men. He had been a Confederate officer. He had been wounded in battle, a sword slash across the chest at the Battle of Columbus. And like hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides of that war, he had been given morphine for the pain. Morphine worked. It worked extraordinarily well. The pain disappeared. The world became soft and manageable and bearable. And then it didn't let go. By the time Pemberton was in his 50s, he was a pharmacist in Atlanta with a serious problem. He was intelligent, educated, genuinely curious about chemistry and medicine. He had spent years trying to create patent medicines, the 19th century equivalent of health supplements, tonics, elixirs, remedies. Some of them worked, most of them didn't. None of them solved his real problem. He needed something that would free him from the morphine, something that would give him energy and clarity without the dependency. He had been reading about 2 ingredients that the scientific world was very excited about. The first was coca leaves from South America, chewed for centuries by indigenous people in the Andes for energy and endurance. Scientists had recently isolated the active compound. They called it cocaine. In 1886, cocaine was not a street drug. It was a miracle. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacies sold it. Sigmund Freud wrote enthusiastically about its benefits. The great Sherlock Holmes used it between cases. The second ingredient was the cola nut from West Africa, chewed by West African peoples for stamina and mental alertness. It contained significant amounts of caffeine. It was bitter and powerful, and it worked. Pemberton combined them. He added sugar. He added various oils and extracts, the exact combination he spent months adjusting and readjusting. He brewed it in a 3-legged brass kettle in his backyard over an open flame. He called it Pemberton's French Wine Coca. And for a while, he sold it as a wine, alcohol mixed with coca extract, marketed as a nerve tonic and stimulant. Then Atlanta went dry. The temperance movement, the campaign against alcohol, was sweeping through the American South. Atlanta voted to prohibit alcohol sales in 1886. Pemberton's wine tonic was suddenly illegal. He went back to the kettle. He removed the wine. He added carbonated water, fizzy water that was fashionable at the time, sold at pharmacy soda fountains as a health drink. He adjusted the sweetness. He tasted it. He adjusted again. And one afternoon in the spring of 1886, he carried a jug of his new syrup down the street to Jacob's Pharmacy. He asked them to mix it with carbonated water and sell it at the soda fountain. They charged 5 cents a glass. On the first day, they sold 9 glasses. John Pemberton had no idea what he had made. He sold shares in his formula to cover his debts. He sold the remainder of his interest shortly before he died in 1888. Broke, still struggling with his morphine addiction, with no idea that what he had brewed in that backyard kettle would one day be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. He died without knowing. Some stories are cruel like that. Here is what we know is in Coca-Cola: carbonated water, sugar, caramel color, phosphoric acid, natural flavors, caffeine. That last item, natural flavors, is where the mystery lives. The exact combination of oils, extracts, and aromatics that give Coca-Cola its specific taste has been one of the most protected secrets in the history of commerce. The company has gone to extraordinary lengths to protect it. For decades, the written formula was stored in a bank vault in Atlanta, SunTrust Bank, where it had lived since 1925. In 2011, it was moved to a custom-built vault inside the World of Coca-Cola Museum. A steel vault, climate-controlled, with a thick door and a combination that very few people know. You can visit the museum. You can stand in front of the vault. You cannot open it. There is a famous story, possibly true, possibly legend, almost certainly something in between, that only 2 executives at Coca-Cola know the full formula at any given time, and that those 2 people are not allowed to travel on the same airplane together. Whether that is true doesn't entirely matter. It became part of the story, and the story is part of the product. Over the decades, chemists and food scientists have tried to reverse engineer the formula. Some have come close, or claimed to come close. Pepsi has tried. Supermarkets have produced their own versions. Blind taste tests suggest that many people cannot reliably distinguish Coca-Cola from its competitors when they don't know what they're drinking. And yet, when people know they are drinking Coca-Cola, when they see the red can, the white lettering, the specific curve of the bottle, it tastes different. It tastes better to millions of people, consistently. That is not chemistry. That is something else entirely. That is what 130 years of storytelling does to a flavor. Oh, and the cocaine. Yes, the original formula contained cocaine from the coca leaf extract. In the early years, a serving of Coca-Cola contained a small but real amount of cocaine, roughly 9 milligrams per glass. The company began reducing it in the 1890s as public concern about cocaine grew. By 1903, they had found a way to process the coca leaves to remove the cocaine while keeping the flavor compounds. The coca leaf extract is still used today, decoconized, stripped of its active compound, but still present. Somewhere in every can of Coca-Cola, there is the ghost of a coca leaf. There is a memo from 1943. It was sent by Robert Woodruff, the president of Coca-Cola, to the company's operations team. The United States had entered World War II. American soldiers were deploying across the Pacific and into Europe. And Woodruff made a decision that was either brilliant patriotism or brilliant business. Almost certainly both. Every American soldier, wherever they are in the world, should be able to get a Coca-Cola for 5 cents. The American military agreed. They classified Coca-Cola as essential to troop morale. The company was exempted from wartime sugar rationing. 64 portable bottling plants were shipped overseas, to North Africa, to Europe, to the Pacific Islands. 348 Coca-Cola employees were given military status and sent to operate them. By the end of the war, American soldiers had consumed more than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola. 5 billion. And when those soldiers came home, to Kansas and Georgia and Ohio and California, they brought something with them besides memories and medals. They brought a habit, a taste, a specific thirst that nothing else quite satisfied. But the war did something even larger than that. For soldiers from Europe, from North Africa, from the Pacific, people who had never seen an American product before, Coca-Cola was their first encounter with American culture. Before Hollywood fully reached them, before American music spread everywhere, before blue jeans and fast food, there was a red bottle with a white label, and it was cold and sweet, and it came from America. In the devastated countries of post-war Europe, Coca-Cola arrived not just as a drink, but as a symbol of abundance, of modernity, of a world that was going to be okay again, of America, powerful, confident, generous, and apparently very thirsty. Some people resented it. French intellectuals famously called the spread of Coca-Cola a form of cultural imperialism. Coca-Colanization, they called it. There were protests. There were newspaper editorials. The French Communist Party tried to have Coca-Cola banned. It didn't work. By 1960, Coca-Cola was available in over 100 countries. The red can had become something that no army, no government, no treaty had ever achieved. A universal language. For most of its early history, Coca-Cola had no serious competition. There were imitators, dozens of them, cola drinks and cola tonics and fizzy brown beverages that came and went. None of them mattered. And then came Pepsi. Pepsi-Cola was invented in 1893 by a pharmacist named Caleb Bradham, just 7 years after Coca-Cola. It went bankrupt twice in its early decades. Coca-Cola was offered the chance to buy it, twice, and refused. Too small, not worth it. That decision would eventually cost them. Through the mid-20th century, Pepsi existed in Coca-Cola's shadow. It was the cheaper option, the supermarket brand, the thing you drank when they didn't have Coke. And then, in 1975, Pepsi did something simple and devastating. They set up tables in shopping malls. They poured 2 unmarked cups of cola, 1 Pepsi, 1 Coca-Cola. They asked people to taste both and choose their favorite. They filmed it. More people chose Pepsi. The Pepsi Challenge, as they called it, went national. then international. Pepsi's sales climbed. For the first time in its history, Coca-Cola began to feel genuinely threatened. The company panicked. They did something that, in the history of corporate decisions, stands alone as a monument to what happens when fear replaces judgment. They changed the formula. April 23, 1985. Coca-Cola announced New Coke, a sweeter, smoother formula, tested on 200,000 people, designed to beat Pepsi in blind taste tests. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. People did not just dislike New Coke, they were angry, genuinely, personally, irrationally angry in the way that people get when something they love is taken from them. They called the company's hotline. 40,000 calls in the first 2 days. They wrote letters. They held protests. A man in Seattle bought cases of old Coke and sold them on the street for 10 times the price. One woman from Georgia wrote to the company and said, in a letter that was quoted in newspapers across the country, that changing Coca-Cola was like spitting on the American flag. 79 days after launching New Coke, the company brought back the original formula. They called it Coca-Cola Classic. The press called it the greatest marketing blunder in history. But here is the strange twist. After the return of Classic Coke, sales went up, way up. The outrage, the news coverage, the national conversation, it had reminded an entire country how much they loved Coca-Cola. People who hadn't thought about Coke in years suddenly remembered exactly how it tasted and exactly why it mattered to them. Some people have suggested, quietly, without being able to prove it, that the whole thing was intentional, a manufactured crisis designed to generate exactly this reaction. The company has always denied it, but Coca-Cola's marketing department has never quite denied it with the full conviction you might expect. There is another story about Coca-Cola, less comfortable than the rest. The company sells approximately 2 billion servings of its products every day. 2 billion. The infrastructure required for that, the water, the sugar, the plastic, the aluminum, the refrigeration, the transportation, is staggering in scale. And scale at that level always has a shadow. Water. Coca-Cola uses enormous quantities of it. In regions of India in the early 2000s, local communities accused Coca-Cola bottling plants of depleting groundwater, pulling water from aquifers faster than rain could replace them. Farmers said their wells ran dry. Local governments investigated. Some plants were shut down by court order. The company disputed the findings. Independent studies reached different conclusions. The truth, as it often does in stories involving corporations and communities and water rights in developing countries, remains genuinely complicated. Sugar. The amount of sugar in a standard can of Coca-Cola is 10 teaspoons. 10. Public health researchers have spent decades documenting the relationship between sugary drink consumption and obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Coca-Cola has spent decades funding research that questions those relationships, lobbying against warning labels, and marketing aggressively in countries where health regulations are weaker. This is not unique to Coca-Cola. It is what large food and beverage companies do. But Coca-Cola does it at a scale that no other company matches. And then there is the question of what the brand represents in certain parts of the world. In countries where American foreign policy has created deep resentment, in parts of the Middle East, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, Coca-Cola has sometimes become the target of that resentment. Not because of anything the company specifically did, but because of what it represents. America. Power. The particular flavor of globalization that feels less like exchange and more like occupation. Bolivia banned Coca-Cola briefly in 2012, a symbolic gesture by a government that wanted to reclaim indigenous culture from foreign commercial influence. Cuba and North Korea remain among the only countries in the world where Coca-Cola is not officially sold, though in both cases it has reportedly found its way in through unofficial channels anyway. Because that is the other thing about Coca-Cola. It is very difficult to keep out. Let me tell you something about Santa Claus. You know him. The red suit, the white beard, the round belly, the warm smile, the reindeer. The specific image that appears on every Christmas card, every department store display, every holiday advertisement in December. That image was created, or rather perfected and standardized, by a Coca-Cola advertising campaign. Before the 1930s, Santa Claus existed in many forms. He was sometimes thin and stern, sometimes dressed in green or blue, sometimes a tall, serious bishop figure, sometimes a small elf. There was no single agreed-upon Santa. In 1931, Coca-Cola hired an illustrator named Haddon Sundblom to create a series of magazine advertisements featuring Santa Claus. The brief was simple: show a warm, friendly, unmistakably jolly Santa enjoying a Coca-Cola during his Christmas deliveries. Sundblom painted Santa as a large, warm, generous, rosy-cheeked grandfather. Red suit trimmed with white fur, black boots, a laugh that you could hear through the page. He painted him for 33 years, 33 consecutive Christmas seasons. The image spread everywhere. It became the image, the one that everyone recognized, the one that felt right, felt true, felt like the Santa that had always existed. It had existed since 1931, created for a soft drink advertisement. To be clear, Coca-Cola did not invent Santa Claus. The figure has roots stretching back centuries to St. Nicholas and Dutch Sinterklaas tradition and the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas. But the visual language of modern Santa, the specific, universal, instantly recognizable image, that came from a paintbrush hired by a beverage company. It is perhaps the most successful piece of visual branding in human history, not just for Coca-Cola, for Christmas itself. So here is what I want you to hold. That cold sip you imagined at the beginning of this story. That specific feeling on a hot day. In that sip is a wounded soldier in 1865, brewing something in a backyard kettle, looking for a way to escape his pain. In that sip is a salesman who looked at a recipe and saw the whole world. In that sip is a brass vault in Atlanta where a secret has been kept for over 100 years. A secret so valuable that two people who know it are not allowed to fly together. In that sip are 5 billion bottles drunk by soldiers in a world war. And the hope, the abundance, the complicated power of a country that sent those bottles everywhere it went. In that sip is a formula that was changed and brought back and loved more fiercely because it was almost lost. In that sip is Santa Claus, and 2 billion servings a day, and 40,000 angry phone calls, and a French Communist Party that tried and failed to keep a red can out of Paris. Coca-Cola is not just a drink. It is a 200-year argument about taste and identity and power and pleasure, and what we mean when we say something is refreshing. And the argument is still going.